Chapter 4. Roadblocks and Renewal. The sit-ins had focused on lunch counters, the Freedom Rides targeted bus stations. Could segregation be swept from a whole town? Student leader Charles Sherrod thought the experiment was worth trying. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee began training activists in the small town of Albany, Georgia, in the fall of 1961. In the following months, Albany activists marched to the bus terminal and to City Hall. They applied for library cards and boycotted city buses. They were dragged by the dozen to the county jail. Martin Luther King Jr. joined the activists in jail after leading a prayer march to City Hall December 16th. The Albany movement was using tried and true methods, but without success. City officials would not budge. Plus, the activists had met a wily opponent in Albany's police chief, Laurie Pritchett. He instructed his officers to be gentle with the protesters. Instead of sending in federal assistance, President John F. Kennedy's administration praised Pritchett for his restraint. Meanwhile, the press was reporting about fighting among the civil rights movement's three main groups: SNCC, King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. King left Albany defeated and depressed in August 1962. Still, the movement had learned some hard-earned lessons. Businesses made better targets than government, and only a crisis would push the federal government to act. The SCLC chose Birmingham, Alabama as the staging ground for its next offensive. This deeply segregated city was home to the infamous Eugene Bull Connor, Birmingham's powerful public safety commissioner. Dubbed Project C for confrontation, the SCLC's plan relied on Connor's brutality to shake up the country and compel federal officials to intervene. SCLC leaders spent weeks mapping out their strategy. Then, on April 2nd, King received a troubling phone call. Connor had been voted out of office, and a moderate segregationist was to take his place. King was pressured from all sides to back off and give the new official a chance, but King refused. In King's view, the new official was just a more presentable version of Connor. As it turned out, Connor stubbornly kept his job anyway. With the city government in turmoil, the SCLC moved forward. Activists picketed and boycotted the downtown stores. King led prayer marches to the steps of City Hall. On Good Friday, Bull Connor arrested King and carted him to jail, just as King had planned. The Children's Crusade. As Birmingham's jails filled, the movement was running out of demonstrators. The Reverend James Bevel had an idea: recruit the city's black children. They didn't have any adult responsibilities to hold them back. Plus, the sight of children being dragged to jail would surely reach the nation's conscience. Letter from a Birmingham jail. Martin Luther King Jr. was sharply criticized for moving forward with Project C instead of waiting to negotiate with Bull Connor's replacement. Local white clergymen took out a full-page ad in the Birmingham News accusing King of being a troublemaker. In jail, King wrote a response to the ad. King's Letter from a Birmingham Jail became one of the most iconic documents of the civil rights movement. In the letter, King eloquently explained his philosophy of nonviolence. You may well ask, why direct action? Why sit-ins, marches, and so forth? Isn't negotiation a better path? You are quite right in calling for negotiation. Indeed, this is the very purpose of direct action. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks so to dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored. Children ages 6 to 18 stayed out of school to demonstrate on May 2, 1963. And Connor took the bait. By the end of the day, school buses carted 959 singing children to city jails. The next morning, more than 1,000 children gathered at Kelly Ingram Park, but they never got the chance to march. As news cameras clicked, snarling police dogs lunged at the children. Then Connor's men turned on the fire hoses. The powerful spray knocked the children over and slammed them into parked cars and against buildings. The whole world was shocked by the images from Ingram Park. An alarmed President Kennedy stepped in to work out a deal between King and the city's business leaders. The two sides announced an agreement the following week. By targeting businesses and creating a crisis, Project C had reversed the failure of Albany. That summer, 50 cities in the South desegregated just to avoid becoming the next Birmingham. I have a dream. African Americans rejoiced as President Kennedy told the nation in June 1963 of his plans to create a federal law to end segregation. Still, the controversial bill could be defeated in Congress. The movement would have to mobilize behind the law. About 250,000 people flocked to Washington, D.C. for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, August 28, 1963. Standing in front of the Lincoln Memorial, Martin Luther King Jr. gave the most famous speech of his career, I Have a Dream. King's voice rang out that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. On that summer day, and amid a sea of hopeful faces, black and white, King's dream felt closer than ever. Chapter 5. The Fight for Voting Rights. President Lyndon Johnson was on the cusp of signing the Civil Rights Act in June 1964. The law would ban racial discrimination in public life, but the right to vote remained elusive. The Constitution protected African Americans' right to vote in theory, but in reality, black voters were thwarted in some communities by local laws and customs. African Americans lined up at voter registration offices only to be turned away by closed signs. If they did get through the lines, they were subjected to unfair tests. How many bubbles are there in a cake of soap, they might be asked, only to be deemed unfit to vote. But few African Americans even dared trying to register to vote. A simple walk to City Hall could make a black person a target for lynching. Nowhere was this truer than in Mississippi. SNCC leader Bob Moses knew the ability to vote was key. Black voters electing black leaders was the only way to ensure a power shift in Mississippi. He organized a massive voter registration project in 1964 called Freedom Summer. Hundreds of Northern volunteers, most of them white college students, would knock on doors across the state. They would also canvass for a new political party, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. The party would challenge the state's whites-only Democratic Party at the National Convention in August. In mid-June, the volunteers underwent training in Oxford, Ohio, where they learned basic survival strategies. They were told not to travel in groups of mixed races or stand in lighted windows where they could be easily spotted by gunmen. They learned tactics such as phoning home base at regular times and driving to avoid being followed. The first wave of volunteers left for Mississippi on June 20th. The next day, 3 men were reported missing. They included 2 white men from the North, Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner, and a black Mississippian, James Chaney. Mississippi had seen dozens of murder cases of black civil rights workers. None of them had prompted a federal investigation. Now, with white lives on the line, the federal government began a massive search for the 3 missing men. It's tragic, said Rita Schwerner, Michael's wife, that white Northerners have to be caught up into the machinery of injustice and indifference in the South before the American people register concern. As it turned out, Ku Klux Klan members had murdered the 3 men to try to scare off the Freedom Summer volunteers. But most volunteers responded with increased resolve. Years later, one volunteer called the 1964 summer the longest nightmare of my life. Volunteers faced the constant threat of violence and arrest, and they soon realized that their help was not always welcome by frightened African Americans in rural Mississippi. In the end, the drive registered only 1,600 new black voters. The Freedom Democratic Party also failed to be seated at the Democratic National Convention. Still, Freedom Summer had stirred the conscience of the nation. Even more, a new army of civil rights workers had been tested and come out fighting. Fannie Lou Hammer and the Mfdp. By the end of August 1964, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party had about 80,000 members. Among them was Fannie Lou Hammer, a disabled woman who had grown up in extreme poverty. Hammer became the face of the new party at the Democratic National Convention. During her televised testimony, Hammer emotionally recounted how she had been savagely beaten by Mississippi police after a voter registration event. "Is this America, the land of the free and the home of the brave?" she asked. President Johnson sympathized with Hammer, but he did not want to offend Southern white delegates. He needed their votes to win the nomination for another term in office. The president arranged to seat Mississippi's white Democratic regulars instead of Mfdp delegates. Hammer was shocked by Johnson's move, but after he was elected, Johnson promised to eliminate every remaining obstacle to black voters. The following summer, he signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The March to Montgomery. By early 1965, civil rights workers had joined forces in Selma, Alabama. They came to push for voting rights in a county where fewer than 3% of African Americans were registered to vote. Then, in February, Alabama state troopers shot and killed protester Jimmy Lee Jackson as he lunged to protect his mother from a beating. Selma's black community was at a breaking point. James Bevel of the SCLC had an idea for channeling their anger. He proposed a 54-mile or 87-kilometer march from Selma to Montgomery, the state capital. The march would bring attention to voting rights while expressing outrage at Jackson's death. About 600 protesters headed east out of Selma on March 7th. They sang freedom songs all the way to the top of the Edmund Pettus Bridge. There they took in a heart-stopping sight. On the other side of the bridge was a sea of troopers with gas masks hanging from their belts. Ambulances and hearses stood at the ready. Out of sight were local Sheriff James Clark and his men. Suddenly the troopers attacked. They beat marchers with clubs, shocked them with cattle prods, and blinded them with tear gas. On horseback, Clark's men swung at marchers with rubber tubes wrapped with barbed wire. That night, ABC broke into regular TV programming to air footage of what came to be known as Bloody Sunday. The American public watched in horror. 2 days later, Martin Luther King Jr. led a second symbolic march to the bridge. As expected, state troopers waited again for the marchers on the bridge. This time, King led marchers off the bridge before conflict broke out. Many young activists saw his turnaround as a betrayal to the movement. Finally, on March 21st, all was clear. President Johnson had sent in federal protection for the protesters. That Sunday morning, 3,200 marchers jubilantly stepped across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. 5 days later, a parade of 25,000 people, white and black, arrived at the Capitol steps in Montgomery. 10 years after the Montgomery bus boycott, the movement had come home, bending towards justice. The march was the last great victory of King's life. The civil rights movement was changing. Many young activists were drawn to the Black Power movement, which accepted violence as a strategy. Women also sought more influence in a movement that had mainly been led by men. The Voting Rights Act was signed into law August 6, 1965. By 1970, most blacks in Alabama and Mississippi could vote. As black officials came into office, the South's old ways began to crumble, but economic and social inequality persisted. Before King was assassinated in 1968, he had turned his efforts to fighting for the rights of poor people. Before his death, King had shared hopeful words about the hard work ahead. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice.